Have you ever fought a video game boss so hard that it made you think there was no way the developers could have made something even more trauma-inducing than what they just did? Well, if that's the case, you're only half wrong. With every great game title comes a great deal of cut content, and in some cases, this includes boss fights of ridiculous proportions. I'm Ewan, this is WhatCulture Gaming, and here are 10 video game bosses removed for being too hard. Number 10. SCP-689. SCP Containment Breach. SCP Containment Breach is a horror game based on the internet collaborative work of the same name. In the game, you play as one of the test subjects who tries to escape the SCP facility after something releases all of those dangerous anomalies kept inside. Containment Breach features quite an impressive number of SCPs that the player has to go up against. That said, the team behind the project had plans for even more monsters, including an SCP so overpowered they had to ultimately remove it from the game. SCP-689, known as the Hunter in the Dark, is a small statue of a creature sitting on a throne. The statue's powers remain dormant when someone is staring at it, but as soon as they look away, the statue disappears, and then 20 seconds later, the person dies an instantaneous death. The team behind the game mentioned that they tried to implement SCP-689 originally, but it was removed when they realized dooming players to an instant and guaranteed death was a little too over the top. I call it funny, but you know, apples and oranges. Number 9. Devil Joker. Persona 2 Innocent Sin. The plot of Persona 2 Innocent Sin revolves around the main characters trying to confront the mysterious villain called the Joker. Throughout the game, it is hinted that the Joker has two personalities, one of an angel and one of a devil. However, when you get to fight him, only his angelic form actually appears. This said, the Joker's devil form does actually exist in the game. It has a fully animated sprite, stats, a list of spells, even voice acting, and yet you don't ever get to fight it. This might seem strange, but all it takes is a quick glimpse at the Devil Joker's abilities, and you immediately realize why the devs opted out of using him. On top of his high stats, the Devil Joker has access to unique and absurdly overpowered abilities that would have been a hell to deal with had they been implemented into Persona 2. He would have been able to one-shot a party member with just one strike, and considering he was only supposed to be one segment of a larger boss, you can probably tell why this wouldn't have been a good idea. Number 8. Giant. Minecraft. Although most people associate Minecraft with building and exploring your creativity, it's still a survival game at its core. When not in creative mode, players spend every night fending off monsters, and there are plenty of special locations with bosses, unique enemies, and other types of challenging mobs. In fact, Minecraft even features a considerable list of unused enemies who didn't make the official roster because they either didn't fit in with what was already in the game, or because they proved too difficult to fight. And yeah, the scrapped idea for a giant zombie seems to fit more into the latter category than the former. Simply known as Giant, which is an apt name given it's a giant, the mob is an upscaled version of the regular zombie model with a whopping 100 points of health and a punch that is capable of instantly killing an unarmored player, like a blocky version of those giant inflicted deaths in Skyrim. So hilarious. The giant mob cannot be spawned normally, but since it is fully implemented in the game's data, you can technically bring it into your session using console commands. The devs likely left that option in so that players who think they're up to the challenge of fighting a giant zombie can have the chance to prove themselves, and then likely get squashed into a neat pile of items and experience points. Number 7. Cole. Dragon Age Inquisition. Cole is one of the several companions available in Dragon Age Inquisition. He's a spirit occupying the body of a boy he failed to save from death, which is why, despite his sweet and innocent personality, his otherworldly way of thinking can be somewhat disturbing. Additionally, Cole is more susceptible to the influence of the demonic invasion that's plaguing the world of Thedas. It was actually an aspect of his character that BioWare wanted to utilize more in the final act of the game, but it proved too brutal from a gameplay perspective. Originally, during the final fight with the main antagonist, Corypheus, Cole was supposed to betray your Inquisitor due to their power. If the player had Cole on their team, he would turn against them, and the final fight would require you to take down both him and Corypheus at the same time. Although a similar situation happens in the Trespasser DLC, with the Iron Bull potentially backstabbing you in the final act, the idea of Cole being an additional boss fight was scrapped as it proved brutal to fight both him and the final boss with only 3 people in your party. Number 6. The original Pandemonium Warden. Final Fantasy XI. Although most of the bosses on this list were removed by the developers prior to the release of their game, the Pandemonium Warden from Final Fantasy XI had to be replaced with a weaker version of himself after the fact. The iconic MMO had to patch his initial concept out of the game after a group of players was to have failed to defeat him after 18 uninterrupted hours of combat. Oh my god. Can you imagine how stinky it would have been in those rooms? As you may imagine, this sparked quite the outrage online, even though I probably would have given up after hour 3. But anyway, eventually Square Enix was forced to apply some serious patches to the Warden, completely changing the fight and making him much less of a threat. The replacement Warden had his health significantly reduced, his attack and other statistics diminished, and just to make sure no group of players would ever dare to spend such an ungodly amount of time fighting the monster again, the devs also forced him to despawn and reset every 2 hours. Number 5. The Tsar Dragon. Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy Superstars are some of the most challenging encounters you'll face in any game. They're essentially enemies that are put into Final Fantasy for those players who think the final boss is just a bit too easy for their liking. However, there is one thing scarier than a super boss. A deleted super boss. Enter the Tsar Dragon, and can we get some cool entrance music here? Yeah, there he is. He's a removed boss fight with the leader of the other 8 super boss dragons in Final Fantasy VI. Though it only exists in the game's unused files, just looking at its exceedingly high stats is enough to realize that fighting the Tsar Dragon would have been the greatest challenge in all of Final Fantasy VI. So great, in fact, that it was rendered impossible by the developers and scrapped from the final product. Its massive health pool, mixed with attacks capable of downing 2 party members at once, is nothing to scoff at. But when you add in its ultimate ability too, hoo boy, the fight might as well just end with an auto-fail. Number 4. The Sky Chase Dragon. Sonic Adventure DX. Sonic Adventure is considered a certified classic among Sonic fans. It features plenty of fun levels, multiple characters to play as, and a considerable amount of challenging boss fights. On the latter front, it even has some bosses that didn't make the cut, one of which was removed due to the undesirable level of difficulty it brought to an existing fight. During Act 1 of Sonic's story, the player has to chase Robotnik's aircraft through the skies as his robotic minions shoot at you from all angles. The sequence is quite short and not very challenging, but that's because originally, the open sky behind Robotnik's carrier was supposed to be filled with more than just tiny drones. The leftover files in Sonic Adventure DX reveal that the sky chase sequences were originally going to feature a massive 2-headed dragon that would chase after Sonic and Tails, breathing fire and shooting laser beams from its eyes. Yeah, if this sounds excessive to you, then you realize exactly why the developers took it out of the game. It turns out a giant robotic dragon with lasers is a cool concept, but it can be tricky to dodge in a teeny tiny little red plane. Number 3. Removed Moon Presence. Bloodborne. The data folders of Bloodborne feature several unseen files of alternative versions of existing boss fights, as well as unseen bosses that never made the cut. One of the better known examples of this is the Great One Beast, which has its own moveset and model despite not being present in the game. However, a much more interesting case of a removed boss fight in Bloodborne is the alternative version of the final boss, the Moon Presence. Yep, in the original vision of Bloodborne's developers, the fight with the enigmatic Moon Presence was supposed to be completely different. The creature had a bigger and bulkier model with much larger tentacles that it would rely on heavily in the fight, unlike its slightly dumbed down in the game counterpart. The removed version of the Moon Presence also had a far greater reach, and the place in which you fought it was a dark cathedral hall instead of the large illuminated field that you see in the final version of the game. Given that the Moon Presence is one of the hardest bosses in Bloodborne, a more advanced version of it with additional skills and tricks would have hurt me very deeply. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, cosmically, I would have been a husk before its presence. Number 2. Original Gravelord NITO, Dark Souls. Similar to Bloodborne, the Dark Souls series features quite a few altered and removed boss fights that exist only as leftover files in game folders. Though most of these files don't say much about what the fight could have looked like, the unused data regarding one of the existing bosses, Gravelord NITO, leads to some fascinating conclusions. The original fight with the First of the Dead was supposed to be much harder than the final product. Instead of just fighting NITO and a handful of skeletons present in his room at the start of the battle, NITO would be capable of spawning up to 7 additional skeletons that would pop out of his body as it got progressively more damaged. Towards the end of the battle, the room would be completely flooded by his undead minions, making it infinitely more difficult and intense. Considering that none of these mechanics are present in the released version of Dark Souls, it's likely that the From Software developers thought their original concept of the boss was too difficult to handle. And considering how hard the in-game bosses are, that's a pretty scary thought. And number 1, the Hydra. Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 has so much cut content that it requires an entire timeline divided into subsections in order to understand it. Some things that never made it into the final version were worked on for months, and sometimes even years, before someone on the development team decided they didn't really work for the game. One such concept was the Hydra, a unique water-based monster that Valve cut out of Half-Life 2 for being too hard to defeat. The Hydra was supposed to be a translucent hive mind of deadly tentacles that would appear throughout the city's sewers to kill anything that intruded upon its territory. Each tentacle came equipped with different weapons and abilities, making each encounter with the creature both unique and unnerving, as you never know when the next tentacle would appear or what it would be capable of. Valve worked on the Hydra for a long time. The creature had a complete in-game model and even a fully designed moveset, but it was scrapped at the last moment due to its wriggling and lanky tentacles proving too difficult to fight in a 3D environment. And those were 10 video game bosses removed for being too hard. Know of any other deleted enemies you'd have liked to fight? Shout them out down in the comments below. Drop the video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want more. Either way, thank you all for watching. I've been Ewan, this has been WhatCulture Gaming, and I'll hopefully catch you next time. Bye!